I got asked how I would defeat Mahoraga if I had the 10 shadows. So we're going to go over that and some other questions from you guys, but if you're not caught up on the JJK manga, then there will be some spoilers here. Alright, so this question comes to us from Captain Luffy, and first of all, thank you for the kind words. But he wants to know, if I had the 10 shadows technique, how would I go about taming Mahoraga, assuming I have the other 9 tamed? And the first thing I want to say is that taming Mahoraga, in theory, isn't that hard. In practice, it's obviously extremely difficult, but if you know what you're going in for, the way to beat him isn't hard. You just have to take him out in one go. So it doesn't have to be like a long drawn out fight where you're just going to get beat and tore up. Assuming you have something in your arsenal that is capable of destroying him in one hit, the Mahoraga fight would last like 10 seconds, you know? Sukuna obviously took him out with one fire arrow after he got done toying with him. Gojo took him out with a single hollow purple. So yes, you need to be strong enough to have such a move, but assuming you do, it's not hard, right? So what in the 10 shadows could fulfill that requirement? And I think it has to be the domain expansion, because on their own, I don't think any of the Shikigami have a move that is capable of completely deleting Mahoraga in one go. Now, we don't know what Tiger Funeral can do, but since we did see it in a totality in the manga, it didn't seem to have any type of Kamehameha wave or anything, right? So my best bet would be to open the domain, and as we saw, there aren't the same limitations on Shikigami within the domain. When we saw Megami use it that one time, he had tons of shadows of the different Shikigami flying around, right? So for my money, it would be to domain expansion and have like 55 Nues all do their lightning at once to just toast them in one go. And we saw how big Sukuna made his version of Nue and how that lightning rained down upon the city. So if you imagine kind of a limitless version of that within the domain expansion, I think that would get it done. So that would be my best guess. And the other only like honorable mention would be if you had like Piercing Ox run for 7 days straight and then summon Mahoraga in its path. But even then, like, it's just an ox and it's just like a physical hit. So depending on how that damage scales, I don't even know if that would work. But those are my 2 best guesses for how to get it done. I would love to hear y'all's thoughts down below. Straw Hat also asked me if I think we'll get to see Yuji's domain, and if so, how do I think it will differ from Sukuna's? And yes, I think we have to see Yuji's domain before this story ends. And how it will differ from Sukuna's, great question. I think it will differ a lot in terms of like aesthetic and theme, but in practice, we'll have to see how it differs, because one, it's going to depend on which technique he imbues into the barrier. Is it going to be Shrine the same way Sukuna does? So will it be like the slashing attacks? Or could he imbue Piercing Blood into the barrier, and we could see what shape that would take, since we've never seen a Piercing Blood domain in the story before. So whatever the case may be, I think it will be pretty different to Sukuna's, but if he does imbue, Cleave and Dismantle, I think it will operate very similarly in terms of its still slashing attacks, but even still, it'll be pretty different, just like we already saw that Yuji's slashes take the form of scissors, because that's how he's envisioned it. And I've actually put out a video not specifically on the domain expansion, but in the difference between how Sukuna and Yuji envision their technique. It's called like the Butcher and the Surgeon, I think. If I recall, I will link it down in the comments below. So I would recommend checking that out for more of kind of my breakdown of it. Next, on this very subject, we have this interesting theory from Tempest, and it's actually really well put together. So y'all pause to read the whole thing, but he's basically talking about Sukuna and Yuji's domain expansions, and how Sukuna, who revolves a lot around cooking, may also revolve around different funeral rites. And he brings up some really good examples here, and basically rounds it out by saying that Yuji's domain will kind of be the same and yet the opposite of Sukuna's, and that Benevolent Shrine will actually allow you to heal others with it. And we just haven't really seen Sukuna use that facet of it, because, why would he? So I think this is really well put together. It's really interesting. We'll have to see what exactly Gege does. The Benevolent Shrine idea has been out there for a while, and it makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm very curious to see what this domain looks like, because again, I feel like it has to happen before the series ends. And Tempest, again, thank you for the great write-up. Next, speaking of Yuji's abilities, Meldrick wants to know if I think his soul punches would be able to split apart DBZ fusions like Gogeta and Vegito. And honestly, that checks out to me. And Meldrick does clarify he's not saying like this is a versus battle matchup, just conceptually would that work in that way? And from what we know, I think so. Yuji is able to specifically target barriers between souls. And in the case of, Megami and Sukuna, it's not as if those two are just going to split apart because Sukuna was never his own true body, right? He's a cursed object within Megami. In the case of a DBZ fusion, it is two distinct individuals that have become one. So presumably, if Yuji just kept battering that barrier, he could split apart the souls and cause them to pop back out into two individual people. So this checks out to me. Next up, we've got a theory post from Milked Tarnished, and y'all know the drill. Move out of the way for anybody to pause and read the whole thing. But essentially, he's saying, what if Kenjaku was the head of the Fujiwara clan and is actually Yuta's ancestor? And he points out some kind of thematic parallels between how, Yuji has this connection to Sukuna. What if Yuta had this connection to Kenjaku? So I could see this being possible largely because there's so much about Kenjaku that we don't know. We know he's ancient. We know he is very powerful and influential in a number of ways. So could he have been an ancient clan head? Certainly. Could he have at least just taken over an ancient clan head? I think that's even more likely. Will we find out anything about Kenjaku's original true body and what his life was like? Because he could have even been far, far older than this, right? Like he could be thousands of years old. We really don't know. So because of that, I don't think there's any hard evidence to point to this, but I do think it's possible. The real question is Gege going to shed any light on this before the story ends? I hope so. Next up, speaking of Kenny, Zuriel wants to know how I think binding vows interact with body swap abilities. So say if Sukuna or Kenny broke a binding vow and suffered some penalty, but then they just body swapped, what would happen there? Now, the short answer here is we don't know because we've had no relevant evidence to directly speak on this. But we do have this panel, which is interesting. And it's from Shibuya when Kenjaku is explaining his whole plan, right? How he made binding vows with all of the sorcerers that will go on to be in the culling games. But also, I did not only enter into binding vows with sorcerers, implying that he entered into binding vows with cursed spirits. He then says, but those vows became null when I obtained this body. So there's a few different ways to interpret this. Some people say that this means that all binding vows can be null if you body swap, which seems like an extremely powerful thing, right? And we know that Kenjaku even fears binding vows himself because he warns Mahito. So if Kenjaku had a surefire way to escape the consequences of binding vows, you would probably think he wouldn't fear them as much. Now, maybe he was just wanting Mahito to know that because Mahito would have no way out of it. So that's possible. That's why there's so many interpretations here. But also, this could mean that Kenjaku wasn't talking about all binding vows, but only very specifically the binding vows with the cursed spirits. Now, why the distinction? Because he very specifically got a body that had cursed spirit manipulation. So perhaps because of the unique curse technique and the control he now wields over cursed spirits, perhaps any binding vows he made with cursed spirits were null. Because maybe he just captured them and consumed them, and then it's sucks for you type of thing. So lots of interpretations. We don't know for sure, but I would again imagine that you can't just get off scot-free by body swapping, or else that would have been something more taken advantage of by Kenjaku and Sukuna at this point. Next, Jojo wanted my thoughts on this screenshot that's essentially saying Kashimo didn't fully incarnate into his true form. He instead purposefully halted the process the same way Yorozu did because he didn't want to incarnate on death's door, meaning that Kashimo was very old when he made the deal with Kenjaku. So for him to transform into his true form, he would be an old man. And I don't know, I never thought about this, but for whatever reason, I just assumed when you incarnate in your prime. And we don't really have any hard evidence to figure this out because all of the culling game sorcerers, we don't know when or how they died. So is this possible? Sure, but I would reckon that it's less that Kashimo did that. I think Kashimo probably fully incarnated and you just incarnate into your prime form, but we don't know. And finally, Sat says, when you catch up with Kagurabachi, it will be interesting how strong you think Chihiro will be in the JJK world. Yeah, I'm actually really interested to see that because I have no idea how those verses compare. Those of you that have read it, let me know your thoughts down below, spoiler free if you can. But I definitely plan on catching up with Kagurabachi, and maybe sooner than later. I've just been trying to make my way through One Piece right now. Anyways, y'all, that's all for this one. Thank you so much for watching.